Hello, friends, and welcome to the City of the Immaculata, a channel where we discuss various topics of history and theology. Today, we are going to be finishing up our discussion on Franciscan theology on the divine ideas according to St Bonaventure. Before we proceed here, if you haven't already, you may want to go back and watch the previous videos we've done on sense knowledge, on divine illumination, and then on the divine ideas, a primer. I would recommend watching those first before going on to this one, as this one sort of is built upon assumptions that you have already seen those previous videos first. Another thing to consider with this is remembering that the key to all of it is that we're getting at how can humans have a justification for our certitude in a world that is unstable and finite. And this is a very important issue as far as Bonaventure is concerned. So, we've worked our way through sense knowledge, through divine illumination, through the divine ideas as such. And now we're going to be looking at the divine ideas specifically through the lens of St. Bonaventure. Now, this has been in the previous videos that we've done, but just to sort of keep track of where we're at, we began with the question of how do we arrive at certainty? How do we arrive at knowledge? How do we make a certain category of judgments that we're interested in here that we've discussed previously? We first went through that process with sense perception, then with divine illumination, and now we've traced back to the origins. One thing to kind of consider with this, and I always say this with my illustrations, is don't necessarily take these as an actual visual representation of what this process is like. It's not necessarily linear in time, though we could say in the order of causality per se, we could trace it back through its origins to the exemplars we're going to do today. But as these things are operating in real time, in a certain sense, they're happening simultaneously. Now, just a quick recap. This was in the previous video on divine illumination, just to let you guys see sort of where we're at. We said that there is this thing that's happening the human, with the powers of the soul, memory, intellect, and will, where as we go through this process, this natural process of sense perception, where we use our memory and we use our experiences of certain objects. So let's say I have here represented this object of the ball. The first contact that the human makes with it, there's a certain the sense knowledge that comes to the human mind that we're able to abstract ideas of this object. And as we proceed to come into contact with that object again and again and again, it sort of becomes clearer in our minds. We're using, at that point, able to draw upon our memories. We're able to draw upon the each individual perception of the object, which I use to kind of illustrate here is getting darker and darker. That's clearer and clearer image of this thing in our mind, where we eventually come to form concepts about these things. But while this is happening, the abstracted species itself, the object that we are coming into contact with, is conforming in our mind simultaneously through this process contuition, where it starts to conform to the exemplar, wherein we are able to have a certainty of the kind of judgment that we're saying that we're making here. And I expressed this in the previous videos. We're not necessarily talking about judgment in the psychological sense here. This is a judgment in a more of an ontological sense, if anything, where I'm not necessarily thinking about the fact that this process is happening, this contuition, but it is happening and it is allowing for a certainty. And what we're doing through here, this whole process of this whole series of lectures, is we're retracing this from the judgment through the concept back to the exemplar from it to its origins. An important key concept and idea with Bonaventure is this idea that comes up several times in his work of exemplarity. And what we're saying here is that the reality of the world that surrounds us is patterned, that is, it's grounded in first principles. Symbolically, these are revealed in scripture, in the liturgy, in the sacraments, etc. But they're also available to us by way of creation itself and by the natural order of things. So as we go out into the world and we're observing patterns in nature, we're able to come up with concepts about the powers of the human soul as an image, where it's eventually, through the revelation of sacred scripture, the image becomes graced as a likeness, all of which points us back towards the origins of these things. All of these vestiges, as Bonaventure calls them, point back, and as we reduce and as we retrace things to their origins, in each instance, the mind is being oriented directionally as we become familiar with the eternality and unity of all things in the one. Interestingly, this is not unrelated to the Logi concepts that you find within St. Maximus the Confessor, but that will be a conversation for another day. So you want to keep this idea of exemplarism in mind as when Bonaventure's talking about it. This is really what he's getting at: exemplarity, right? It's this process of going out into the world and through the powers that we have of abstraction and reasoning, that we are able to see these signs that point back towards the origins of all things. Now, I want to talk a little bit here also about God's infinite knowledge. With divine simplicity, which is an article of the faith, where we say that God is non composed, he's infinite in a fully maximal mode of spiritual perfection. This is that he knows all realities, past, present, and future, both actual and possible. And we talked about this in the primer last week. But again, kind of wrap your mind around the idea of this, of what we're saying when we talk about God's knowledge of things. God doesn't just have an infinite knowledge of past, present reality as they are. He also has a knowledge of them as they could be. This knowledge, this infinite knowledge, is divided into how he possesses it in himself and how we are able to speak of it. And the key idea here is that we can speak of God's knowledge as an exemplar of all knowable things because he is truth, light, and he is infinite. Now, to pull together some of the attributes of God, I borrowed this from a uh, paper that Dr. Goff provides in one of his lectures on Franciscan philosophy, and I find it to be pretty helpful as we're sort of like drawing together sort of some disparate ideas into pulling them together into what we're talking about here, right? But we have two attributes of God that we're talking about: simple, which is to say that God is non-composed. There is neither an increase or decrease. There's neither an increase or diminution in God. All things in God are immutable. Another attribute of God, though, is that God is infinite. It's the most basic concept of God that we have, not lacking, that God is not lacking in any perfection. When you combine these two ideas together, according to Boethius, you get the concept of God as eternal, a simultaneous perfect possession of life, what Bonaventure himself would call that being which is in full flight from non-being. Another way of looking at this is what they would call a simplicitor simplicius perfectionis, a simply simple perfection. So you have the idea of God as eternal, right, which is his simplicity and his infinity. Together, we can deduce from that there are truths about God's truth here pertains to all knowable and known truths, of which God is the source, the lux, the transcendent quality of truth, which is expressed as light or lux. And it's expressive of all possible truths through God's oneness, which is to say his divine knowledge as an exemplar of individual things that we experience. And it's interesting that Bonaventure would say that that God is like creatures in the sense that he likes to create. And Bonaventure, he has this concept, this notion of connotation, which says that God knows creatures by virtue of what they create. And that would be an interesting thing to discuss at another point. But all of these ideas, these attributes of the divine being, sort of pulling them together, are how we are going to express how God comes to know things, right? So Bonaventure says that God knows things by a likeness of them. This would be opposed to knowing something in its essence, where the thing must be experienced and abstracted to be known. So we talked about that a little bit last time, right? Like, what is it for me to know my child? Well, the very first thing is I have to experience my child. My child has to be born, has to exist, and then I have to abstract certain um, qualities of his essence, his being, as it were. Well, God doesn't necessarily have to God doesn't have to experience my son to know my son. He's known my son eternally. And Bonaventure says here is that he would know these by means of a likeness. And the divine ideas are how God knows a thing that is not himself, while also not being identical with God in themselves, right? So we have to keep in mind when we talk about God's simplicity and his infinity, we're not able to parcel out, we're not able to partition these various things within God. There has to be a sense in which there's a unity of all of these. So the divine essence has a knowledge of, let's say, you take two things, right? The man and the dog, two things which are not reducible to each other, but the knowledge of them must exist in God, and there must be a minimal distinction between them as possibles as God understands them, and as a like by way of a likeness, that they are singular with their existence in God, yet not reducible to each other. So how do we get around this? Well, there's various ways that people have attempted to speak about this. And an interesting thing with Bonaventure here is he talks about a simple resemblance, which he would say is a one-to-one relation of proportions. And it's not unlike a univocal concept, per what you would find later in Scotus's idea of univocal concepts, where something is like another thing, with one thing being the exemplar, where the exemplar is distanced from the other thing by a certain disjunct, be that finite or infinite, just for example. Now, what I know through the created thing is not coextensive in regards to the quantity within the divine idea, because the divine idea is radically identical with the divine essence, as we remember the attributes of God here. So we have the created idea of a thing, and then we have the uncreated idea of a thing, distanced by this disjunct. But there's a one-to-one relation between the two. The relation is such that the divine idea of a dog and the created idea have this simple resemblance. Now, Bonaventure does want to avoid the language of Scotus about the univocal concepts, but Scotus is very subtle in his articulation of what he's getting at with the univocal concept. So, I think in my own training and in my own personal view, I don't think these things are exclusive to one another, but in terms of terminology, Bonaventure does avoid Scotus's language. So continuing on, the other way that we can say that God knows a thing is through what Bonaventure calls simple intelligence, which is just to say that God knows all possible things that could be. And two important ones is this idea of per speculum, that is, God knows things as if through a mirror, as if looking through a mirror, where God's ideas of the thing serve as a mirror that reflect his truth back through the created thing as a sign, as an exemplar, another important idea here, where the divine idea, like in a creature, has a sign function ad intra. And as a sign, per speculum, as if through the mirror, for the creature who comes to know it comes to know of it through abstraction principally, right? So the person is abstracting these idea of a dog, and as he experiences this, he's going to come back time and time again through this. Okay, I'm starting to get an idea of dog as dogness, which as a sort of mirror reflects itself back through the exemplar that exists within God himself. And it's sort of here that between perspeculum and the exemplarity, that Bonaventure's in his mind bridges the gap between the created and uncreated ideas through divine volition, which is to say, again, right, like, so how do we begin to access the divine ideas? Well, it's sort of a trial and error, right? It's a process of, okay, I have experienced this particular dog, Bella. Then I come to experience another particular dog, Spot, and then another dog, Daisy, and all of these dogs are reflections back. They mirror back to the one exemplar idea of dogness, which is contained within God. All the actual impossible, um, all the actual impossible particulars of dogs that we experience that come together as this unified exemplar in within God. So now, going back to arriving at this whole concept of certainty, which is very important in Bonaventure's mind, we come to know through creation as if through a mirror. Knowing God and per the exemplar, the mind attains to the eternal art. And this is made possible through divine illumination, right? Remember, contuition. So it's not just the process of abstraction itself with Bonaventure. It's a very important concept here to get your mind around the divine illumination. Go back and watch that video. But it's through knowing it's made possible by divine illumination, but it is through the process of abstraction the mind begins to obtain to the eternal arts, where we begin to know God through his exemplars. Now, both the created mind and the object known, so both you and the object that you're experiencing, they're both unstable. And I think this is something that all sides would admit. You could find this from Thomas to Bonaventure, right down through to modern day skepticism, right? You're dealing with a created mind and you're dealing with an object that is, both are unstable. That is to say that they are changeable and they are finite. And they do not justify nor explain uh, the certainty that we seem to have, or the knowledge that we possess, right? And the problem of that is a very, if you acknowledge this as a problem, it's actually a very serious and deep problem. Bonaventure himself acknowledges this, preemptively, long before Hume or Immanuel Kant. Bonaventure says, no, we actually do need something that's immutable and stable to required to justify our certainty that we have when you're dealing with two very contingent, unstable things: a created mind and the object that we're coming to try to know. So how do we curtail that, right? How do we get around that? Well, per Bonaventure, we arrive at certainty when the mind obtains to the divine ideas. This non-conceptual judgment that we've been talking about, right? So again, and I want to reiterate that by judgment here, we're not saying that there's a sense in which I can say I make a judgment through the process of abstraction, but that's not what we get at when we talk about this idea of contuition and divine illumination. There is a non-conceptual judgment that takes place, which we do in a sense whenever we make a proper judgment, right? That I've gone through this whole process of experiencing the object over. I've experienced Daisy, Spot, and the other various dogs that I've experienced, and I say, yes, this species that I have abstracted is true. But all the while that is happening, there's another non-conceptual judgment that's taking place that begins to conform the mind to the immutable and stable exemplar that exists within God. And due to the radical simplicity of the divine essence, right, which we discussed earlier in this, due to that radical simplicity of the divine essence, God is wholly simple, wholly immutable. There is no, even in the sense that we are able to make um, distinguish between various attributes of God. There is a simple oneness within God and His truth and His eternality and His simplicity and His infinity. So if we know one divine idea, everything that is in or related to that idea is also certified through this process. And that's a really amazing thing. Now, you can disagree with Bonaventure here, but I want to just like say if you are looking for a good justification for a good foundation to rest the work that you do out in the world, right? Whether um, whatever your view of things are philosophically or theology, this is a good justification, and it allows us to go about doing the work of the church with a high degree of certainty and stability and assurance of what we're doing. So I think Bonaventure has done an amazing thing here with this, with the work that he does, and it's certainly something that is worth spending the time to sort of get comfortable with and wrap your mind around with, and have as your own sort of foundation for your own foundation and own justification for the certainty that you have of really anything that we experience in this life, anything that the mind is trying to attain to certain truths, where we use our memory, our intellect, and our will. These we're gonna spend some more time later. It's a very important when we start getting to the idea of within Franciscan theology of the will and of volition and how these things interact within the soul, in where the intellect, as the thing that it's the makes the true, the good known to the will. It provides it to the will, right? We're going to spend some time with that later, but this is a wonderful foundation to sort of build upon to get to those some of those other uniquely Franciscan concepts where we're going to discuss later about will. So I hope you guys enjoyed this series. Like and subscribe. We will spend some more time with it in the future. I really want to kind of parcel out, I think, in greater detail, maybe some of the disputed questions, like in particular, question 4 with Bonaventure on the knowledge of Christ, and kind of maybe dive back into some of that Augustinianism that's within Bonaventure here, and really like sort of parcel some of this out. But I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. God bless you all, and I will see you next time.